Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to the sixth video in our Universal series. The topic for today is going to be something, like we said last time, a little bit different than what we've been covering recently. We've been covering mostly topics that have to do with literacy in the sense of comprehending what it is that we're looking at and understanding stories and the materials that we're going to be covering in class generally. But today, what we're going to do is shift to a different skill and just generally start approaching the idea of learning how to articulate our thoughts and our comprehension of certain materials, but in the form of an essay, in the form of writing. Now, to begin with, I wanted to, and it's going to be a briefer video, by the way, because I'm not going to make this what would you want to say? A comprehensive essay writing video. That would be more like a series that we may do in the future. But this is just a general overview on what I tell my students are general skills that we're going to always be mentioning, whether it's 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade and beyond, that they want to remember, they want to kind of always be drawing back into their minds as they're sitting down to write an essay in general. So to start off with, I always tell my students, and we also discuss this usually in our faculty, depending on what particular school that I'm teaching in, we discuss basically three skills that we are trying to impart into students. We're trying to have students grow to increase their literacy overall. And I've branded that sort of the trinity of skills for literacy, as it says here. I want to walk you through those really quickly, just so you can kind of get an idea as to what our main goal would be if you're trying to look for a pathway to becoming more literate overall. Now, the first one is comprehension. So comprehension is what we have been doing in the past several videos for, I would say, over 90% of the time that we've been discussing that stuff. Comprehension is simply the ability, as it says here, to be able to quote unquote read whatever you may be looking at, whatever you may be absorbing. Now, when we traditionally think that in, especially the American education system and the Western education system, we're thinking of that as reading prose or verse, reading a written word and being able to comprehend the meaning of it. Whether that be the literal meaning, whether that be the figurative meaning, whether that's the deeper kind of thematic meaning and all the levels of depth you can go through in that. That's fine. That is one form of comprehension. However, I would also say that that would extend very easily into listening to a story or speech. So something I always like to do, just to be a little bit provocative with parents and with teachers in general, is to remind my students and remind anyone who is really paying attention to our content in the classroom is the fact that I would like to remind them the fact that we as a human species have really only been reading materials, like actually sitting down and reading words kind of and really trying to, on a mass scale of our civilization and our societies for not over certainly not over 1,000 years. It's been a relatively new, especially if you look at the span of recorded human history, which is about 5,000 years. The whole process of trying to have everyone in society being able to sit down and read the written word in front of them and comprehend it, that's a relatively new skill. However, that does not mean that for the other 4,000 years of recorded human history, that the majority of people were illiterate, were unable to comprehend anything of any significance. That's absolutely not true. In fact, what you, of course, are going to learn, whether you're taking my humanities class, whether you're taking ancient history class, an ancient literature class, you're going to find out that the majority of human beings very much had a high level of comprehension through the means of listening to stories and to speeches that they were exposed to at that particular time and place. So what does that mean for us? That means for us nowadays, if you want to, for example, sit down and listen to an audiobook or listen to a YouTube video that educates you about something, or listen to me, yap on for over an hour and a half, that's totally fine. I would actually argue that is a sign of a high level of literacy. I've known people in my life who don't sit down to read, these whether they're 300-page novels or these, 3,000-page epic novels, from Russia, of course. And they don't do that, but they will sit in the car for over, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, and just listen to these series of different podcasts and different interviews and all this kind of stuff, which are essentially just dialogues, right? If you want to use an ancient example of that, like the Socratic dialogues, all the books written, or all the books, all the works written by Plato about Socrates, those are all just dialogues. Those are effectively like, several hour long podcasts from the ancient world. So if you're able to do that, I think that that's an absolutely strong sign that you have a pretty solid level of comprehension if you're able to sit down and listen to those things. Then to something a little bit more contemporary, but still, harkening back to the ancient comprehension skills, ancient comprehension modes, is being able to view something, whether it's a visual art form in the form of a play, in the form of, a piece of like actual, like a painting or something like this, or a movie. I think those absolutely are things that we could comprehend and read at the same level of depth, that we maybe even deeper in some instances than we would a actual written piece of artwork. So being able to do that, I think, is just as important, maybe even more important, particularly in the past, I would say like 60, 70 years, because it's been such a proficient means of people communicating things to us, whether in the movies or TV shows. Now, of course, I have to throw in a fourth one, which is maybe something like a piece of music, which is something that is very abstract and very much on the intuitive, artistic mode of understanding the world. But being able to read music, being able to really kind of actually understand the language of sounds and the beauty of music that it's trying to communicate to us, this is a very, very high form of comprehension, but I think an equally valuable one. So that's one skill. The next skill, of course, is a kind of a cliche term that we've always been throwing around in education and pedagogy for a while, which is critical thinking. Now, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with anything that sounds that cliche and a little bit sounds stale at this point, even though we've been using the term for upwards of 30 years now in education. Critical thinking, sure, we can call it that. I would, if I had complete control over the conversations around education, I would maybe want to just advocate to shift that just towards thinking in general. Are we able to think? Are we able to comprehend and then really be able to process, to debate, and maybe kind of deepen or more enrich our understanding of a piece of material simply based on our comprehension of it? So that's what this is. Now, if you want to really push the critical part of this phrase, yeah, that's the ability to not just brainstorm and really process a piece of information that you've understood, but it's also the ability to maybe kind of poke at it, maybe to debate it, maybe to compare it to other things that we have seen and we have known, find some links, find some incongruities, and then go from there. So a very, very valuable skill for sure. Now, to then speed along and jump to the end here, our final skill is the ability and the process of articulation. Articulation can take many different forms. Now, the traditional way to do that in the ancient world was to speak in some way and to give an actual phonetically concrete articulation to a concept that you have understood or to something that you need to communicate. I'd like to tell my students that this is, in some sense, we always think of it like, oh, I got to sit down and write an essay. Oh, I got to sit down and write, this long speech about, this poem that I don't care about, all this kind of stuff. I like to use the real, more practical example of this in your interpersonal lives, or even in the life of your own mental health. The process of articulation and the ability to articulate extends to that level of our life, as well as the kind of more, mundane at times, schoolwork kind of life. The ability to sit down and comprehend what you are feeling, what you are thinking, and what you are kind of struggling with is a skill that anyone will have to learn and really, really benefit from learning if they go into something like counseling, like psychological counseling. If they are going through any sort of traumatic or even just kind of difficult period in their life, the ability to sit down and really not just comprehend and think about what is wrong, but being able to then articulate it to yourself. If you can kind of name the problem, right? This ancient sort of motif of being able to give names to something that's really, really negative, to speak its name, is something that we see, in mythic stories as being a very powerful thing, but also you see it psychologically today, that if you can really mention what is wrong, that usually alleviates a huge amount of stress for people. We of course see that in the medical field, right? When you're suffering from something that you don't totally understand what it is, a diagnosis is an articulation of that. It's like, aha, we figured out what it is. Let's actually articulate what it is that you're suffering from, how it is you got to this stage. Now we've essentially laid out we've gotten rid of about 50% of that problem, so that we can now work on the last half, which is figuring out how to solve that problem. It's the same thing in your interpersonal relationships. If you're actually struggling with your relationship with your friends, with your peers, with your teachers, with your parents, with your future boyfriend or girlfriend, future wife or husband, kids, whatever. If you're able to articulate finally, and powerfully what it is that you are struggling with, or what it is that you are feeling or you're going through with those people, that is an incredibly powerful skill. Okay. So the other form of articulation, I just have to throw it in there, similar to the music one in the previous section of comprehension, is that we usually can find some form of articulation in artwork as well. Okay, all artwork is in some level, along with many of the other things that it's trying to do, it is articulating something to us. So if you are someone who is, that very, very kind of left side of the brain, you're very much in that kind of openness, intuitive sort of way of thinking. If you struggle with being able to communicate in written, articulated words, that's fine. You might do better in something like art if you can kind of communicate what it is that you're trying to get across in artwork. This is also, a very, very powerful skill. Obviously, at the end of the day, as an educator, and as someone who works in the field of education, I want to tell you that our main goal, of course, is not just to sort of highlight the skills you already have, but we're trying to get you to have all three of these. We're trying to get you to really develop yourself with all three of these skills, so that you can comprehend whatever it is you're looking at a very deep and sophisticated level, so that you can think about it and you can really kind of process it into the rest of your understanding of the world, and then that you can articulate effectively something to us about whatever it is that you have understood. Okay. So with that being said, we move on to the skill of essay writing. So why is it that we write essays in school? Is it because teachers are boring and we can't really come up with better assessment? Not entirely. It's also because it is, in its purest and really perfected sense, it is a really, really good method of being able to test you for and teach you about that whole comprehension, articulation, and thinking form of literacy. So in that sense, ladies and gents, I want you to think about essay writing as just that. It's a way to practice that skill. It's a way to really kind of hone and focus on those articulation skills. Now, in the best case scenarios, what I have found is I've had actual students tell me, whether it's from teaching a psych elective or teaching like a humanities elective, I've had students come back and tell me and say like, hey, I literally have been going through this, whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety, whether it's trauma, or something that they've been struggling with in general, like the directions in life, whatever variety of problems they had. And they literally sit down and they tell me that, I've written out like a note page about this. It's like, bullet points and notes. And I actually ended up writing effectively what was the outline of an essay about this problem that I've had. And I would say, fantastic, that's actually what it's for. Or if they have like, we have kids in college or kids, thinking through these more, abstract ideas that about their beliefs or about their issues that they're going through in life, whatever, they will actually sit down and write effectively what is not just a journal entry about it, not just a kind of a vomiting forth of all their thoughts, but they'll actually kind of craft it and mold it into something that is essentially an essay. That's what it's meant to be. So I'd like you to think about it more as a skill that's honing itself towards that sort of an end product, and that sort of a thing that you could do later in life or now, than just something that we are really forcing you to do because we're bored and we don't have any good forms of assessment for you. So think of it more as something that's authentically quite powerful for your own life. Okay, that being said, how do we write an essay? What are the steps of writing an essay? Well, I'm going to walk you through this general essay guide that I've created for my students relatively quickly. I'm not going to go into too much depth. I'm not going to sit here and write an essay for you. I'm just going to give you some of the basic principles about essay writing that I give to my students. To begin, we need an intro paragraph. What is the purpose of the introduction paragraph? It is basically two things. first and foremost, you need to give your readers, give the people who are listening to you some sort of introduction as to what the heck you are talking about. Okay, so as it says here, usually if we're writing about a piece of literature, you want to tell us what is the topic of information, or what is the topic that we're going to talk about with some relevant information around it. So if it's a book, you're going to tell us, hey, here's the author, here's the title, here's what the book's about, all that sort of stuff. If it's an issue, if it's an author, if it's a historical event, same thing. You need to give us some essential information about whatever it is that we are going to be reading about, whatever you're going to tell us about, okay? Now, I generally tell my students, again, you got to remember that I am teaching 9th to 12th graders. So, these rules and these standards that I'm communicating here and that are written in this particular guide can change depending on the student, depending on their skill level, depending on the grade that they're in. So just take that with a grain of salt. Generally, I tell them you got to keep your discussion of the topic probably between 2 and 4 sentences long. Now, the reason, again, why I give these sort of sentence length or these sentence, numerical guidelines is because I recognize that there are some students who are going to go on to, study English and become writers and all this sort of stuff, and they intuitively understand this. They know how to push the boundaries of that. They know how to really flex their skills of writing and break these, traditional standards of 2 to 4 sentences for a summary. That's okay. That's fine. But I also have a lot of students who have no idea how to formulate an essay and have no idea how many sentences should be in a paragraph, et cetera, et cetera. So as a general rule, I provide these for them, for both students, essentially, for both types of students. Generally, no more than 2 to 4 sentences, depending on the length of the essay. Okay, so most of the essays we're going to write in high school are going to be like 5, 6 paragraphs long. Maybe depending on the class, you might have a several page long essay. So generally, depending on how long it is, you want to shoot for nothing really over like 5 sentences, I would say, for your relevant summary of the text. If you break this rule, my concern is that you're going to be writing 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, blah, 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 blah. Before you know it, your entire first page of your essay is just one giant fat summary of whatever it is you're trying to tell us about. That is not appropriate. Okay, why? Because that's not what we're trying to understand. We're trying to understand what we're going to get to in this next part, which is your thesis. I'm not interested in reading a summary of whatever it is you're telling me about. If I wanted a paper that just summarizes the events of this book, this thing, this historical event, this author, whatever, we could find that really easily. It's called Wikipedia, right? I want your thoughts on this. I want your thesis on this thing. I don't want just some summary of it, okay? So, in the harshest sense, sometimes I will tell my students, not sometimes, but pretty often, I will tell my students, look, if I get your paper and I just see like a long summary, I'm just going to fail you right off the bat. I think the Regents exam is similar. It says in the AP exams as well, they say, do not summarize the text. Do not just summarize the text, okay? So just stay away from that. Keep it, short and sweet to the point, and then move on to the actual point of the essay, which is the thesis, okay? What is the thesis essentially? It's a statement that basically tells us what you are going to be saying and what your particular answer is to the essay prompt. If there is an essay prompt, if the essay prompt is saying like, hey, write me an essay about the tragic flaws of Romeo. What is the tragic flaw of Romeo? Write me, an essay about what are the deeper themes of The Lord of the Rings, et cetera, et cetera. You get all these typical prompts, which is a really good thing because it gives you a direction on where to write. That's what the thesis is. It is your answer to that. Okay, so you get a prompt that says, hey, explain to us what is the hamartia, right? What is the tragic flaw of Romeo in Romeo and Juliet? Oh, okay, that's the prompt. The thesis would therefore be your answer to that, which is what? Oh, the hamartia, the tragic flaw of Romeo in Romeo and Juliet is Romeo's excessive impulsiveness. That is the hamartia, okay? So that statement right there, that's the thesis. Same thing for every other essay, guys and gals. Every essay needs some kind of thesis, with the exception of the instances when I will ask my students to write what I call just an informative essay, where you're just informing me about something, okay? Just tell me, just blabber on, about whatever, you want to teach me about. That's something, but that's, pretty rare. I only do that in some electives, essentially. So aside from that, you always need a thesis. Now, what if you don't have a thesis in your essay? I kind of give the same rule as with the summary. If you don't have a thesis, I usually will fail my students right off the bat, because what has it demonstrated to me? It's demonstrated to me that you might not even know what you're supposed to be writing about. And it also demonstrates that you don't understand these really fundamental points of essay writing, okay? So right off the bat, you will receive a 50% in my particular class if you are missing a thesis and or if your summary of the text or whatever it is you're writing about goes, excessively beyond the length of like 4 to 5 sentences. Okay. And now, by the way, most of my pretty much all of my classes allow for a rewrite of every major essay. So even if you bomb that, that's fine. You can still redo it. So don't worry. I'm not that much of a tyrant. Okay, so really quickly, the intro is done. We have our summary, we have our thesis. How do we get into the bodies? The meat, right? The whole sandwich analogy for an essay. You basically want to do a couple things here. You need to have some organization of your topics, okay? So for example, let's stick with the Romeo and Juliet one. If we are writing an essay about Romeo and Juliet's flaws in that play, we gave you the thesis, all right? So we know that his flaw is impulsiveness. Well, what is the point of the body paragraph then? Why can't we just kind of call it a day? The body paragraphs, ladies and gents, are essentially where you prove whatever it is, or I shouldn't say prove, that's an inappropriate word, where you really argue and try to demonstrate to the best of your ability what you said in the thesis, okay? So sure, you're telling me Romeo's flaw is his impulsiveness. Well, where do you see that? How should I really understand that? Can I really believe you when you say that? Why is that an accurate statement about the play? How do we demonstrate this? With the body paragraphs, okay? So you want to think of the body paragraphs as that step of the essay. How do we demonstrate this to our readers? Obviously, we're going to have to give examples in the story. That's the best way to do so. We're going to give you some examples of where we see whatever it is that we are trying to argue in the text. We're going to give some actual direct text citate or direct text evidence, textual evidence as well. Now, do you just kind of throw it all out there? And I wouldn't say that that's the best idea. You want to try to organize it in some way, shape, or form. How do you organize your body paragraphs? How do you organize your evidence? Well, it's always going to vary pretty dramatically on whatever it is you're saying. So for example, with the Romeo and Juliet example, you could simply get away with organizing your body paragraphs, whether there's 2 or 3 of them, simply by the chronology of the play. So like, for example, body paragraph 1 will be about, Romeo in act 1 and 2. Body paragraph 2 will be about Romeo in act 3 and 4, body paragraph. And like, you kind of see where that's going, right? That's a simple way to organize it. If you're doing like an argument essay, then our organization becomes very, very different, right? Every paragraph might be a particular reason supporting whatever it is you're arguing there. One paragraph might be, a counter claim or kind of addressing what people say against your arguments. That's fine too, right? But basically what I want you to understand is there needs to be some logic to your organization. I need to be able to look at your essay, I see the thesis, and then I'm reading your paragraphs, and I can see, is there some reason to rhyme and reason to what they're doing? And if you really are at a loss, especially if you're writing about literature, just fall back on the whole chronology idea. Just give me kind of sort of the order of events in the story and show me, examples in chronological order. I accept that as a fair form of organization. Okay. Now, when it comes to evidence, providing evidence for your thesis, there's usually some sort of limit, like particularly in my class, I usually tell my students, like on every essay, how many pieces of evidence from the text I want them to include. Now, again, that can vary depending on who your teacher is, depending on what I'm asking you. But generally, ladies and gentlemen, what I ask is that the piece of evidence you are giving me supports the thesis, supports your reasoning strongly, all right? So if we're arguing that Romeo is impulsive, do you want to give me some random quote from like, Peter in the middle of Act 1? Unless it is directly involving Romeo or contrasting him in some way, probably not, okay? Do you want to just give me, Romeo's statements about, like when he's making fun of the nurse? And it's like, no, like we need to find something that's really relevant to this, that really demonstrates that this kid is impulsive. Same thing for every other thesis, okay? Now, I'll show you in a minute how you can do that and kind of the way in which I want you to organize that in a minute. But just know that the evidence needs to be relevant somehow. And then something that I'm not going to go through all of these, but something that I really see students generally, from 9th to 12th grade, they kind of struggle a little bit with is just the proper way to integrate a quotation into a sentence, right? So let's say you find a quote that you really, really like, and you're like, oh, I got to use this, right? So like when Romeo says, oh, I am fortune's fool, it's like, okay, great quote. I want to put that in here somewhere. There's a lot of different ways you can integrate that into your writing. One thing that I don't want you to ever do in writing is just to begin your sentence with a quotation from the text and then end the sentence when the quote is ended. So in other words, you just kind of slap the quote in the middle of your writing. That's not a proper way to write. You want to actually integrate the quote into your writing somehow, some way. So for example, I could tell you this, or I could write this. In Act 3 of Romeo and Juliet, Romeo proclaims, quote, I am fortune's fool, unquote, after he kills Tybalt. It's like, perfect, exactly. That was my writing with Shakespeare's quote kind of smushed into it. That's sort of what we're doing here, all right? You could also do something that I really, really like what my students do, and if they can grasp this, it always looks really, really nice in their essays, which is to sort of use a quote as a paraphrase as you're writing something. So for instance, you could write, to give that same example, Romeo even proclaims himself to be, quote, fortune's fool later in the play. It's like, perfect. You could have like taken the quotes away and that would have just been like a perfect sentence. That's why I use it as like a paraphrase quote. So that's still technically a quote. You're directly quoting Shakespeare's writing, but you're kind of weaving it into your own writing. That's a beautiful way to quote something, all right? So good, solid. All right. There's a lot of different other ways. Take a look at these ones right here. I gave you a couple different examples. If you want, you can steal from that. That's totally fine. But you can also just Google search like easy ways to integrate quotes into your essays or into your writing really easily. Okay. Now, this gets back to that whole like numerical equation I teach my students sometimes. I tell them generally one line of writing per quote, depending on the type of essay, right? So if you're writing like a basic analysis of literature, a basic thematic analysis, you might not want to have your quotation. What I mean by that is be more than like one line long on your actual written paper, right? Like if your quotation is like 2, 3, 4 lines long, and then you're going to have like a little bit of your writing at the end of it, that just looks kind of sloppy, right? You don't want to have this big chunky quote. Unless, again, you're writing a long essay where you want to give a passage and like you analyze that passage and use it as a great example. It's like, okay. But for the majority of the time when we're writing these kind of shorter essays, these 4 to 5 to 6 paragraph long essays, we don't need those long passages. Now, as a simple kind of logical rule, one of the reasons for that is that, as it says here, longer quotes need more analysis and discussion. Okay, so if every line, and this is particularly true, excuse me, particularly true in poetry. So poetry, infamously has a ton of meaning compact into it. So if you analyze one line of a Shakespearean sonnet, we could do that for an entire paragraph. I could really stretch that sucker out. But if you give me like 14 lines, of the whole sonnet, then we're going to have a lot more to say. So you want to be careful about that. You don't want to give me a ton of writing from the author that you're quoting, and then just give me a couple little lines that you're using to write about it. It's like, man, that doesn't look proper. That doesn't look right. Okay, quotes can also technically be one word, depending on the type of essay. Again, so if you're doing a literary analysis where you're analyzing the writing and the writing strategies and literary elements of the author, probably not going to work. The whole one word quote probably not going to work. But if you're analyzing something like thematically, that's okay. If you're really nitpicking like the discussion about the diction that someone's using, then it's okay. So you got to kind of use your own judgment to think when it's okay to use a one-word quotation, okay? And of course, again, depending on the essay, depending on the teacher or class, you want to cite the quotations or inform us using in-text citations or a works cited page, okay? I won't go through that, but just, check with your teacher, check with whoever it is at the time that's kind of guiding you through that, like what kind of citation they want you to use, okay? Now, for the actual important bit, the analysis of whatever it is that you are discussing, you need to explain how the information around the evidence supports the thesis. Okay, so you've given me this example from the text, you've given us a quote that kind of goes along with it. Well, so what? Okay, the actual meat and bones of that process comes here. This is where I would say, personally, when I really get into assessing my students' writing, this is really the bulk of where I assess how they've done. Is are you basically analyzing this thing? Are you understanding what it is you're trying to say? Are you getting any good insights, any good information, any good comprehension down about your essay or about your thesis? So if you've given me, a line of quotations and you're going to explain it to me, explain to me, where it takes place in the story, how it's relevant to your thesis, and any other relevant information about it. That process, I, again, usually tell my 9th and 10th grade students, maybe even 11th grade sometimes, I say shoot for 5 to 6 sentences per line of quotation, okay? Do we have to always follow this rule? No, not at all. Okay, you can break that. You can kind of rework that as much as you want, depending on your writing skills. But it's a generally solid rule of writing. If you're really struggling with writing, if you're really afraid for your writing grades, just try to shoot for this, and you'll be better off. Now, how do we, solve the problem classically of being like, well, Mr. G, I don't know what else to write. I don't know how else to do this. Couple different things there. I usually tell my students 2 or 3 things. Number one, if you're struggling to kind of extend your analysis to meet the requirements that I'm looking for or that your particular teacher is asking for, first thing you want to do is go through your analysis and make sure that you have what I call spelled out what it is you're trying to spell out. A lot of times, and this gets back to that skill of articulation, a lot of the times when we try to articulate something, we skip over a lot of information. We haven't really communicated all the information we should effectively. So, you want to make sure if you're like analyzing Romeo's flaws, that you're not just saying, oh, he's impulsive. It's like, okay, well, what does impulsive mean? How is he impulsive? Well, he's impulsive because he killed Tybalt. Okay, but why did he kill Tybalt? How is that impulsive, right? Because you can kill people sometimes and it not be that impulsive. Why is this specific example impulsive, right? Look at what we just did there. We took that one line and we can extend that into 3 to 4 lines, right? So you really want to dig into it. And that is an annoying process. That is a very thinking kind of heavy process. But that's one easy way to extend your writing to the point where you get to where you should. Another way to extend your writing when you are not meeting the requirements that you're looking for is to simply make sure that you have addressed all the aspects of the thesis that you're supposed to be addressing, all the aspects of the prompts. Like if we're asking you about literary elements and themes and all this kind of stuff, are you actually covering all those? Have you really done all of that? So like I said here, in this example, if your essay is a literary analysis, is your analysis telling me about the context of the quotation? Are you discussing the literary elements being used there? And to what extent are you actually discussing them? Like, are you just saying, oh, this is using characterization? It's like, well, how? How is it using characterization? And to what extent? And in what ways, right? Again, extend that into several more sentences. How does it develop the theme or ideas of the text? Again, you can extend that into 3 or so sentences. Now, what I think you're probably sensing here is that, you can really, really stretch this out, but you don't always want to. Again, we need to find that balance, that kind of sweet spot between not saying enough, right? Not articulating ourselves enough and over articulating ourselves. Okay. So a big mistake a lot of high school students make, a big mistake a lot of adults make, is thinking that because they can talk and can write and articulate a lot of stuff or for a very long time, they assume that that means that their comprehension, their thinking, and their articulation are strong. That's not necessarily true at all. So again, that's why I try to really limit or kind of give us some parameters to work in. So if a student comes back to me and they hand me this, 10-page essay when I only asked for like a 2-page essay, I'm going to look at it and I'm going to be like, okay, like fine, you wrote 10 pages, but did you actually write and analyze something for 10 pages? Or did you just, as we say nowadays, yap for 10 pages? Did you just inflate your sentences for 10 pages? And unfortunately, this is a skill that we see used particularly in AP students and students who are inherently more articulate and are inherently able and comfortable using the English language. They like to really kind of just overinflate their sentences and their writing. You don't want to do that. You want to really kind of chop down the fat of your sentences and get the main points across, okay? So that's the analysis. Probably the trickiest part. We'll talk about it more and more as we kind of get into the specifics of whatever class that we're actually going through in order to what we're actually teaching, okay? Note on organization here. Yeah, your body paragraph should be organized in some clear way, not one giant paragraph or 6 small ones. Same thing that we mentioned before. Try to organize in a way that answers the thesis step by step, right? That's a particularly advanced way to organize your body paragraphs. If your thesis is asking you to compare and contrast something, if your thesis is asking you how a character develops, something like that, you kind of want to match the sequence and the logic of your organization to that question, okay? Okay, so if you've done that, take a breather. That's fantastic, right? You've done the bulk of the work for the essay. Now, how do you write a conclusion, essentially? A conclusion is usually a little bit daunting to students. It's a little bit tricky because it can be repetitive and it can require a little bit of stylization, which not everyone is comfortable with. First and foremost, you want to begin with a reminder. You want to kind of stretch us back or bring us back to where or what it is that we were actually trying to say in the thesis, right? Remind us what your thesis was. And what that kind of does for your audience or for your readers is that shows us that your reasoning is clear, that you're focused, right? You're not just kind of like blabbering out about 18 different things. It's like, no, you knew what you wanted to talk about. You had your sequence of things that really kind of lined up with it. And now you are concluding it, you're wrapping it up, and you have sufficiently answered that question. That's what we're looking for. That's going to be gold if you can do this. So restate the thesis, remind us of the thesis. And you want to also summarize what you've said, right? You want to summarize the examples that you've given in some way. So again, with the Romeo and Juliet example, Romeo's tragic flaw is his excessive impulsiveness. I'll give you maybe like 3 or 4 examples of where we see that in the text in chronological order. And I've discussed them, I've analyzed them, I've told you why they are impulsive, how they contribute to his downfall, why they really qualify as a hamartia, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well then you want to, in the conclusion, yeah, remind us that this is his tragic flaw. And then maybe kind of remind us, look, like, and we particularly see this in this scene, and this scene, and this scene, right? That's all that would take, would be just to remind your readers that you have, in fact, demonstrated what you're saying in the thesis. Then finally, we want to give some kind of flourish, right? We want to give, and it's kind of like the reason I call it flourish is because it's like just a parting word. It's kind of like the wave goodbye. Like, okay, we are done. We have done what we're supposed to do. It's that mic drop. It's that kind of bow at the end of your essay. Give a final note about the importance, the beauty, or the relevance of the topic overall, right? So the importance, you could say, yes, we know, we can clearly see that William Shakespeare is trying to communicate to us the importance of not being impulsive because it will lead to tragedy. Perfect. We could say that William Shakespeare has beautifully demonstrated the danger of being impulsive. Perfect. Or has really beautifully established how this particular flaw exists within this particular character. Or we could say the relevance of the topic overall. Yes, we can see that impulsiveness is something that we grapple with even to today, and we can find a perfect example of how to, or a perfect example of why we should not, let this flaw go unaddressed in the character of Romeo. Perfect. Okay, so do something stylistic like that. Again, this can be kind of challenging because it requires a little bit of, what should we say, artistic and kind of performative talent on the side of the writer, but that's what we're here for. We're going to improve that day by day. Now, when it comes to grading and correcting the essay, and kind of maybe I wouldn't even say grading, I would say like your own rewriting of the essay and your editing of the essay. Something I really stress to my students from 9th to 12th grade is the use of conventions, right? The use of writing conventions to make sure that their essay is not just structured well, it doesn't just answer the prompts, really well, but it also kind of actually fulfills the standards of proper articulation well. And we usually think of that as like spelling and grammar. I'm going to add one thing onto that. That's also style. Okay, style is a huge thing that I like to really teach my students and help them assess themselves on, and prepare for me to assess them as well. So first and foremost, When we're writing an essay, we want to be clear as to whether or not it's appropriate to use the first or the third person voice. So should we be writing, I think that Romeo's tragic flaw is this. This is appropriate only if the teacher and the prompt tell you, write to us your thoughts on this particular topic. Tell us what you think, right? If you are directly being invited to use the first person or to talk about yourself and your own understanding, that's fine. Okay, I think that then it's fair. And again, double check with your teachers every time as to whether or not they would approve of this. But personally, for like, over 80% of the time in my classes, I ask my students to use the third person. I like to get them a little bit outside of their own heads and outside of their own opinions and just writing to me about how they understand something. Okay, so third person, that's what we want to do. So depending on the prompt, avoid writing in the first person, I, me, and my. Now, the alternatives to that, if you're really struggling to kind of get away from that, you can find ways of stylistically referencing yourself or other readers of the text. So for example, instead of saying, I notice that Romeo's flaw is this, you could say, readers can notice or can see that Romeo's flaw is this, or one could see that Romeo struggles with this, or we as readers can see this, or the audience is meant to see this, right? There are different ways to referencing the person who is reading the text. That's totally fine, okay? You want to really avoid, unless, again, your teacher says otherwise, you want to avoid what I call self-referencing in your writing. I usually tell my students this is one of those cardinal, like instant fail things that they could do that I will just not accept in my essays that they're giving me. Again, depending on the prompt, do not reference the fact that you are writing an essay, okay? Do not sit down and say, for my book report, I chose to read this, and my thesis is this, and my first quote is going to be this. Don't literally write that out. That is very, very kind of like lower level comprehension or understanding of how to articulate yourself. We want to really elevate this and just say the answer to the prompt, right? Say, not for my book report, but just say the book, blah, blah, blah is about blah, blah, blah. Like just jump into the whole discussion of the book. Don't tell me, who you are and what you're reading for class. That's not appropriate. Okay, that's not appropriate for a higher level way of writing and articulating yourself. Okay. Another way, probably the more common thing that I see is, I think it's actually the most common thing that I see in terms of conventions that need to be, tweaked and improved for students, is the use of informal language. Okay, we want to make sure that we don't use language, diction, word choice that is informal, that is too conversational, as it says here, abbreviated or too slangy, right? Phrases that you would hear in everyday conversation with your friends, your family, all this kind of stuff. This is not entirely appropriate. You want to use what's called formal language. So, for example, conjunctions, right? Can't, wouldn't, couldn't, shouldn't. Those are abbreviated ways of speaking. Those are not fully formed, sophisticated ways of speaking. We use them to make our speech quicker for convenience. That's not what we're doing in writing, okay? So don't use conventions. Don't say can't, say can not. Do not use words that are essentially slang, like things that you would see when you're writing a text message to someone, like I wanna, I'm gonna, you shoulda. Like that's again really like informally abbreviated because it's not even following a grammatical rule. It's just a totally abbreviated sort of slang term. A phrase like kind of, that and sort of, things like that. There's a lot more examples, by the way, but I just picked these out because I saw them pretty commonly the past year I was teaching. Those are conversational. Those are also typically, when I'm going to call down here, fatty words, right? Those are just words and phrases that are just stuffed into the writing that we don't need. They're not necessary. You could take them out and get the exact same level of content in your writing. So why are they there? It's just there to kind of add extra space, and make your essay longer. Get rid of them. We don't need it. Okay. So no informal language. Finally, we want to try to elevate our diction. We don't want to just kind of avoid grammatical errors, but we actively want to try to use better and more accurate, more sophisticated language. Now, don't misunderstand me there. Like I said about the whole writing length thing, can you write way, way too much? Absolutely. The same rule applies for using elevated, higher, sophisticated diction. Can you sit down to write an essay and have a thesaurus in front of you and use these, 10, $100 multisyllabic words, that like I can't even remember from like the SATs. You could do that, right? What is the point of that though? That just sounds kind of silly, right? That just sounds like you're really flexing and trying to show that you know vocabulary better than anybody. Now notice as an actual articulation tool, that's pretty bad because the majority of people that read that aren't going to know what the heck you're talking about. It's going to be difficult. It's like your audience is only meant for, these like 160 IQ educated people. It's not appropriate. Okay. Try to make your whatever it is you're articulating accessible to everyone, right? Some of the best writers in the world are just more communicated, are more effective at communicating to people because they use simpler vocabulary, not low level, not vocabulary that's inappropriate, but just vocabulary that's easier for everyone to access. Okay, it's a very effective tool. Now, some words that are generalized are words that I see as kind of breaking that rule of not just being simple and accessible, but they're too simplistic, right? They're too unspecified. So that's another element that I bring into this. We want to use more sophisticated terms, but what we really want to do, guys, maybe even more importantly, is use accurate terms. We want to use specific terms. I've said it in a previous video, but the English language has the largest vocabulary among languages in the world. We have so many words that we could choose from. So really try to find the right one, all right? The one that fits with your style and fits what you're trying to say. Therefore, a cardinal sin, for writing, as my professors in college used to teach me, is using the word thing. If you just say, oh, this thing or that thing, or, Romeo's upset about this thing or whatever, you can't do that. That's the most kind of general term. We want to know what thing, what it is that you're actually talking about, right? What it is that you're referring to. You only use the word thing as my English professor taught me if you're being poetic and you want to be like John Milton and say man is a thing of slime, right? That's what you want to do. Okay. Same thing with referencing the author, right? We don't want to say the author demonstrates blah 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 blah. Again, the author has a name. They generally will have a name unless we're talking about like Beowulf and we don't know who the author was, right? Give me the author's name, right? Say Shakespeare, the story, right? Again, unless you're talking about the structure of that particular piece of literature and literally the structure of the story, it's probably inappropriate. You want to reference the novel, right? The novella, the epic poem, the sonnet, the play, the tragic play, something like that. Be specific, be accurate. We also want to get away from the phrase quotes. This is something kind of on the side that I've noticed in the past couple of years. We don't want to say, oh, one quote that demonstrates, how this thesis is relevant. We don't want to say that, right? We want to say, an example of this is when Romeo says blah, blah, blah. Just remove the term quote, right? The term quote is a little bit too self-referencing, okay? So say, for example, the passage, the line, the description, the response, something like that, instead of saying the quote from Romeo, Now, same thing, kind of always, in the background of our style, critiques is don't be repetitive with the phrasing, right? So you could say something like, oh, the first example is when Romeo does this. The second example is when Romeo does this. The third example is when Romeo, it's like, that's kind of repetitive, right? Find another way to do it. The first example is this. Another good example is this. Maybe the best example is blah, blah, blah. Like that's a little bit better, right? That just sounds a little bit better. I see that you're doing that structure. You're following a structure, but you're not being repetitive, okay? You're getting a little bit more sophisticated in your style, okay? Finally, some overall tips for writing your essay. For students that struggle with beginning, who need sentence starters, who struggle with like articulation in general, try to at least begin by writing as you would speak. Okay, a lot of students, sort of have this huge divorce, like kind of like from what I was just saying over here with informal language. They have this huge divorce in their head where they've only used informal language their whole life, and they struggle with how to articulate something in front of a crowd, in a formal sort of way. Well, I would say maybe just for starters, sort of ignore that and then just write how you would speak. And then you can see where that's going. Then what you would do is go back and edit it and try to make it more formal as you're moving along. And then, the more you write, the more you're going to realize, oh, I can just do that filtering and that editing process in my head, and I can just write as I would speak informally in my head, but as I'm writing it, I can easily just sort of write it formally. Okay, that's fine. You can do that for sure. So try to use that sort of metaphor, that sort of what do you want to call it, that cue for yourself. Try to actually write as you would speak. Now, speaking of editing, when you're editing, and I recommend that everybody edits, remove excessive wordiness. We said this before. We want to make sure that we cut out the fat from our writing. That's something I usually practice with my students at the beginning of multiple classes throughout every unit, is like, how do we make something sound more efficient and more concrete? Double check conventions, right? Go back, make sure you're not using conjunctions, make sure you're using formal language, et cetera, et cetera. So all the stuff we just covered here, go back, make sure you're doing all that. Do so at least a while after writing. Yeah, don't sit there, finish your essay, unless you're on a time crunch. Don't sit there and, okay, I'm gonna go edit all this stuff right now. No, take a break. Like if it's an essay you're doing at home, if it's an essay you're doing for class, it's like just put it down, walk away for a little while, take like a 5-minute break, then go back and look at it. Why? Because for some reason, our minds as human beings, we really struggle with being able to edit and see the mistakes in our own writing. Okay, they just stand out much more overtly to someone who has not seen the writing before. So if we can kind of almost lose our memory of our writing for a bit, go back and actually start to read it, those errors will, and those awkward moments in our writing will stand out more. Okay. Yeah, and then of course, create an outline and organizer first. I give my students the option of using graphic organizers. This is what mine looks like in class, just a universal essay organizer. You can see that it follows the same structure of what I just taught you, essentially. We have our intro with the summary and the thesis. We have body paragraphs. We have maybe like 3 or so organizational topics that we would organize them by. We have an example from the text that we're going to be talking about. We have a quotation that is relevant to that example. And we have a bigger chunk for what we would analyze, what we would say in there. And that goes on for however many examples you want to give. I give them like 6, for example. And then, of course, we have the same process in the conclusion as we just went there before. But what I like to tease my students about is oh, Mr. D, do you have a copy of that organizer? Do you have a copy of that organizer? It's like, yeah, of course I might, but like, why can't you just write down your own, right? It's so simple. Take a look at this thing, right? It's like a couple boxes, with a couple different words. So just learn to, create your own organizational style in some way. Learn to organize it. There's nothing wrong with, right when you're sitting down for, a major essay, or you're sitting down for like an AP exam, to sketch out an organizational note for yourself, or essentially like a makeshift graphic organizer. That's totally fine. Okay. So that, in short, is a basic outline, or a basic kind of covering of things we want to think about when we're actually writing an essay. Those are the basic skills, the basic things we want to be aware of. Now, those will change, and the actual process of teaching those things and learning those things is of course best done in the classroom. I will probably put out a video at some point of me actually writing an essay and show you the steps and the processes of what that can look like. But I'm not going to do that here. This was meant to be more of just a quicker overview of all those basic skills. So that essentially ends our universal materials series. I might add some down the road if I find another topic, but that's essentially it. All right. So I hope that has been helpful for you. And if you have any questions, I will be here and available if you need any help. Thank you.